welcome to Parish Pub. I'm Stephen, and I created this channel to explain and to promote the thesis that the happiest and healthiest human lifestyle comes from living in a local community ordered according to the principles of subsidiarity, with two institutions at the center of the community, valued above all others. The parish, where people gather to acknowledge and interact with the divine, connecting them with their metaphysical, moral, and meaning source, and the pub, where communal leisure can take place, and regular face-to-face presence bonds the community together in profound ways. Now, what makes this ideal, this vision, different from a lot of our current towns and cities and general sprawl, which do have churches and pubs in them, is that in the parish and pub model, the parish really would be central to our social organization in a meaningful way, with the singular metaphysical and moral vision of the good, which is shared within the walls of the parish, then flowing outward to instruct and inform all aspects of life in every sphere, including home and family, business, public and private property, education, resource sharing, community events, and on and on. It assumes and requires a broadly shared set of values, stories, loyalties, and faith. Now, I know it's uncouth in certain company to bring up the idea that a shared common faith might actually be better for society than a broadly assumed secularism that makes room for a variety of neutered religions operating in their own little boxes, as long as their doors just open inward to receive anyone who wants to walk through those doors, but not doors that open outward for any real convictions about lifestyle, policy, or any other ideas that might actually have the audacity or pretense to escape their property lines and shape the world around them. But regardless of these hopes and preferences of secularism, any real faith or tradition worth its salt does actually have consequences which flow from its core tenets. They have ideas about the world as it is and how they think it ought to be. And these ideas, whether they're elaborated from a pulpit on Sunday morning or from a minbar on Friday afternoon, can have genuinely competing implications. So the solution to this potential problem in the West since the Enlightenment, so-called, has been to structure our societal institutions according to the supposedly neutral concept of secularism, which favors individual autonomy and each person's ability to decide for themselves what's good, rather than favoring any one religion's idea of the good for the whole society. But there's something we need to admit about this solution, this agreement that will let everyone operate by their own ideas of what the good is, the ethic of autonomy, as Christopher Watkin calls it. Watkin, in his book, Biblical Critical Theory, puts it this way. The ethic of autonomy presents itself as the denial of any shared substantive figure of the good. Everyone is free to choose their own vision of the good life. However, this refusal of any shared vision of the good itself becomes the very thing it ostensibly opposes, namely a shared vision of the good. It brings with it a blueprint for society just as prescriptive as the shared visions of the good it sweeps aside, because a society built on a principle of relatively unrestrained individual choice is not neutral. A society of autonomous individuals is not a society without a shared vision of the good, but a society in which autonomy itself becomes that shared vision, bringing its own norms and expectations. Even that seemingly neutral agreement that we largely try to operate by in our current society, that everyone is free to do their own thing, has actually smuggled into the system one corresponding rule. No one has the right to insist that anyone else's good is bad, or mistaken, or incomplete. According to secularism, the one objective good is that there are no objective goods, only autonomously decided subjective goods. And while there is no objective morality admitted, there is one single moral rule that everyone must adhere to. Do not impose your good on anyone else. But why? Where does this one overarching good come from? whence this one inviolable rule? It doesn't seem to come from nature. It doesn't really show up in human history before the Enlightenment. It's a very recent development, and it doesn't stand on very solid ground at all. It can easily be challenged, and it often is. And when it is challenged as a stopgap, we've had to rely on Thomas Hobbes' solution in Leviathan, where a powerful state uses coercion and the threat or use of violence to quell conflict, to bully everyone, essentially, through laws and courts and police, back into that barren secularism where you can do whatever you want as long as it's not unto others. Now, the idea of not injuring others, that certainly can be found in nature and in human history. Among the ancient Greeks, Confucianism, Christianity, it's spread around a lot of places. It seems to be a human intuition. But the corresponding good of secularism, everyone can decide what's good for themselves, that's the novel idea that has never built or sustained a society. Even from the beginning of this experiment called the United States that I live in, the pursuit of happiness, held up as an inalienable right in our first founding document, didn't mean the right to pursue absolutely whatever you please. According to the late Professor Carol Hamilton, when John Locke, Samuel Johnson, and Thomas Jefferson wrote of the pursuit of happiness, they were invoking the Greek and Roman philosophical tradition in which happiness is bound up with the civic virtues of courage, moderation, and justice. What Jefferson meant by happiness was not merely personal pleasure or fulfillment, but the realization of a broader goodness, a full life lived virtuously. The older conception of happiness was the achievement of a state of being widely deemed good by a living culture, informed by a living cultus, a shared vision of morals and metaphysics. Once, men believed themselves to be bound by, or at least bound to, a certain objective standard for goodness and behavior. But these objective values became more and more undermined in the 18th and 19th centuries, especially in writers like Diderot and Hume, who promoted what Alasdair MacIntyre calls moral emotivism, the idea that right and wrong are determined by our feelings and emotions. Now, this eventually led to the broadly accepted assumption that we not only had the freedom to pursue happiness, but the freedom to define happiness, to define the good. And when the inevitable conflicts arose between, all these fully autonomous individuals choosing for themselves clashing ideas of the good, well, the reign of secularism had to begrudgingly admit at least one of the old objective values, that of not harming or infringing on others. And when this one poorly justified, rootless moral command is ignored, predictably in secularism, the strong arm of the state is there to mop up the social spillages. Now, it should have been obvious from the start that secularism, a system that insists on one good and one moral rule while simultaneously insisting that there are no objective values, would be an incoherent and impotent governing philosophy, a non-philosophical philosophy. And even if you argue that it's not really trying to be a philosophy, but merely a pragmatic way of governing a multicultural, multi-religious society, still, it can only do that by operating on the borrowed capital of one or another coherent, intact philosophy. And that capital will run out when poked and prodded enough by people challenging its system. And we're already starting to see that in both America and Europe right now. So, what's the solution? The solution, I believe, as I'm sure you've probably guessed, is the Parish and Pub model that I'm trying to color in and articulate on this channel. It's a vision of local life rooted in ritual, sacraments, and sustenance, both spiritual and physical, where life remains enchanted not only within the walls of a place of worship, but out into the streets, the home, the pub. And it's a vision where we actually belong among and to each other, bound by duty, bound by charity, to love, not only to tolerate our neighbor. In secularism, reality is closed. The world is material. It's what you see in front of you, and that's it. Period. There's no transcendent source of truth, of goodness, of beauty. Values are subjective preferences or social constructs. Morality becomes arbitrary. What's good is what people happen to agree on or feel strongly about. Truth is personalized and relativized. But in the parish and pub model, reality is divinely created and sustained. The world is sacramental, charged with meaning, pointing beyond itself to God. There is an objective good, and we're exposed to it, trained on it, calibrated to it in worship, moral instruction, philosophy, and tradition. And every aspect of life flows from this shared understanding of reality's givenness. Because secularism lacks a shared vision of the good, culture fragments into tribes of opinion, each defending its preferences with no common moral grammar. Art becomes self-referential or nihilistic, no longer rooted in truth or beauty, but in novelty, irony, or protest. Our once shared civic rituals die out or become hollow performances without substance. But the parish and pub model actually makes the culture cohere with common worship and common festivity. Music, architecture, storytelling, all would actually draw us together instead of splitting us apart. And importantly, this cohesion wouldn't come from coercion, but from broad participation in a shared story that encompassed us all, enacted week by week at the altar and the hearth. Secularism's borrowed capital, nostalgia, fragments from the past, they're going to fizzle out. We need living wells of energy and cultural creativity whose source is a living cultus with an altar where fire from heaven still regularly falls. Where the parish and pub are central to life, community is not optional or an accessory, but a basic and assumed good. People gather in space-bound, tradition-shaped communities instead of fluid or often virtual neutral zones. The parish, the pub, the town square, the library, the community gardens, the main street, these are places of incarnation where we would be seen, known, forgiven, fed, and fostered. Secularism atomizes, but this vision roots. And finally, secularism strips society of a shared teleology. There's no agreed purpose, no objective good, no shared ends. As a result, we can't agree on what beauty is, so we parody it. We can't agree on what virtue is, so we mock or ignore it. We can't agree on what the human person is, so we redefine it endlessly. This all leads not to freedom, but to cultural exhaustion, to social alienation, and to moral confusion. Secularism, with its moral emotivism and its ethic of autonomy, is at best a husk of the sacred order it replaced. It retains the language of dignity, justice, and freedom, but without the roots to nourish or defend them. The living sacred order flowing outward from the parish's altar, the place where heaven descends to touch the earth, still truly believes with conviction in dignity, justice, and freedom. It gives back to people what secularism has taken: a reason to live, true neighbors to live with, and a coherent reality to live in. So, if this vision of an enchanted, coherent, communal reality strikes us, compels us, energizes us, excites us, how do we get it? How do we attain to it? Well, we have to start with ourselves, our family, our neighbors, whatever neighbors we can convince. No one can be coerced into a parish or a pub or into a community built around them. We have to either find them or build them, and then demonstrate their merits, their beauty. And we'd have to demonstrate that we ourselves are transformed by that vision. The rule not to coerce or force others is, in secularism, arbitrary. But in the parish and pub model, it's bedded down in objective value and has even flowered beyond that minimal stem in the teaching of Jesus to love thy neighbor as thyself, the golden rule. The way to gain neighbors to the high vision I'm calling us all to is by invitation, service, and self-sacrifice. So let me know if you've seen this exemplified anywhere, if you're one of the lucky and fortunate few to be living like this now, or if you're just now trying out the first steps to transform your less than ideal town or city into a more parish and pub type place. God bless.